All right. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Oops.
Mayong lahat.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so sorry we started late. We're supposed to start at 9. Biglang nag-brown out dito sa office. So I thought hindi babalik yung kuryente at yung internet. So we have 12 participants. All right. So let's start because we actually have another speaker by 11, no? So I hope we can cover everything we need to cover with my part of the session before her time. Okay. Talk. So once again, good morning, everyone. So I hope you can see the screen. So today is the 5th virtual session of Spark Track. So we'll be talking about startup funding. So our topic is actually understanding startup funding. So that's the gist of it. So the objectives of this Spark Track session is to help you understand startup funding by introducing you to different kinds of funding terms. You'll surely be meeting as you go forward with your startup journey, and of course, get a gist of how startup funding works in the Philippines or even globally. So please, take note that the point of this session is not to give you, it's not to let you delve deeply into startup funding because it's very complicated. It's very technical, yung mga, its processes and everything. What we're going to do is give you a walkthrough on how startup funding works and what it is. Okay, so before anything else pala, I forgot. As you can see, we're already using Zoom. This is possible because of our partnership with YC Philippines and the US Embassy. Thank you very much to them. Okay, so we'll be using Zoom for the rest of the Spark Track sessions. Okay, but we will still be using Lark for meetings and consultations. Okay. Okay. Isa pang disclaimer, guys. Medyo mabigat tong topic na to. So please bear with me if you think it's boring or masyado mabigat sa utak. I tried my best na the presentation is very, very, hindi man general, basta in layman's terms. Ako mismo na hindi business management ang background is nakakaintindi. Okay. So what exactly is startup funding? So there are types of stages of startup funding, and we'll go through it one by one, as I said earlier, through layman's terms, as much as possible so you can easily understand it. So we're here to help you understand terms related to startup funding that we're sure you'll encounter in your startup journey, especially when you start pitching in competitions and to potential investors. But before we delve into the world of startup funding, let me introduce to you a concept that most of you are probably trying to do right now, especially since you're in your early stage of your respective startups. Okay, so here it is. This is the concept, bootstrapping. So from the word bootstrap, which means to get oneself or something into or out of the situation using existing resources. Bootstrapping in entrepreneurship is building a company from the ground up with nothing but personal savings, which is common with early stage startups. And if you're lucky, the cash or profit coming from the first sales of your product or service. So bootstrapping is the opposite of startup funding. In other words, bootstrapping is a process whereby an entrepreneur starts a self-sustaining business, markets it, and grows the business by using limited resources or money. So this is accomplished without the use of venture capital firms or even significant angel investment. Bootstrapping is so common that it is likely to be part of the history or nearly every successful company, such as Airbnb, GoPro, and MailChimp. So for new companies, bootstrapping might be an effective model because it encourages simplicity and flexibility during the early growth phase. But of course, as your startup progresses, so does your growth phase, and it becomes more feasible to lean towards startup funding. So as we go through this session, later on we'll enumerate reasons why we're encouraging startup funding. Okay. So again, bootstrapping is the opposite of startup funding. So now that you've learned what bootstrap, because you're surely gonna meet what bootstrapping is during your startup journey. Okay. Sorry guys medyo maingay kasi nagre-renovate dito sa school. Okay. So let's go back to the topic or to what we're actually supposed to be talking about, startup funding. So when you hear someone mention startup funding, you immediately think of investment, right? So you're not wrong, all right? But it's not entirely correct as well. Startup funding or startup capital is the money needed to launch a new business. It can come from a variety of sources and can be used for any purpose that helps the startup go from idea to actual business. So there are types and stages of startup funding or startup investment, and we'll go through that one by one so you can easily understand it. Okay. So here are the types of startup funding. As you can see, there's friends and family, banks, loans, crowdfunding, startup enablers, government grants, venture capital, angel investors, and series funding. So here's the thing. I enumerated everything that are usually used by companies or startups of any stage. So we'll go through this one by one because this is how you define startup funding. You simply can just say na startup funding is when you fund a startup because there are different types and there are stages. So family and friends. Several startup founders, especially when they're still in the early ages of their startup, turn to family and or friends to help them out with their initial funding. The reason behind this is simple because you don't have to convince them the way you have to convince a bank, an investor, or a venture capitalist. Your family and friends is actually a great source to kick off your startup's funding. So I'm pretty sure some of you have already ventured toward this, especially in your early stages of your startup, lalo na nag-ooperate na iba sa inyo. So however, it should be assured that the personal and business parts of your relationship with your family and friends are clearly outlined. Okay? Sabi nga nila, discourage yung business relationship between mag-asawa, magkapatid, or masira yan. But I think it can prosper as long as, you draw a line, okay? A clear line for that. Okay. But yeah, most of the time, this isn't the case. So disclaimer lang din, I'm stating here that one of the types of startup funding actually comes from family and friends. I'm not saying it's encouraged or discouraged because the types of startup funding that we're showing you are actually, it's entirely up to you which one you're going to implement, okay? So there are some entrepreneurs who choose to avoid this type of funding because of the possible personal complications. So ganun lang kasimple sa family and friends. So let's head on to banks or loans. So another common type of funding is getting it through bank loans. Loans secured by small business or early stage startups is a more traditional way of getting startup capital. And this is usually opted for because it is somehow easier for some startups to secure a loan than to get a venture capital. What I'm saying is, to some startups, between filling up loan application forms and pitching arduously all over the country to potential investors, they rather stick to the former option because they find it easier. Now, the pros to banks and loans as a startup funding is securing bank loans is actually a good option because traditional banking institutions are very, very careful with their funds. Unlike other venture capitalists who are keen at taking huge risks for the possibility of reaping big rewards, okay, banks are very careful. So, you mag-apply ka nga, but you go through process then. Another thing why some startups lean towards loans from banks as their funding, because unlike taking in an investment, founders retain full ownership of their startups. So wala kayong kahati. Okay. So that's the startup funding when it comes to banks and loans. Okay, so the third one is crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is another method of raising capital through the collective effort of connections or network, which may comprise of your customers, friends, family and relatives, and even some investors. So in a nutshell, crowdfunding is the practice of funding a project or venture by raising small amounts of money from a large number of people, typically via the internet. Okay. So take note that crowdfunding and fundraising are two different things. Yes, they're both about raising money, but fundraising usually seeks financial support for various cases and charity, and it is traditionally done offline. On the other hand, crowdfunding is the process of funding your project, which is your startup, of course, by accumulating money from various individuals. Another thing that separates fundraising from crowdfunding is for the latter, crowdfunding, you have to provide your backers or financiers the product when it is completed. So, kailangan mapakita niyo yung finished product. So any kind of startup can actually be considered for crowdfunding depending on the donors or the financiers or the platform. So some of the platforms, I'm pretty sure you've heard of them, that usually cater to crowdfunding all over the world is Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Rocket Hub, Patreon, Circle Up, and Lending Club. Lending Club, I mean. So you can find different kind of startups there. I think you can use GoFundMe, but it's actually for a personal crowdfunding platform. So we don't usually encourage that. Okay. So kung may nakikita kayo, I think nakikita niyo sa news, yung mga startups usually leaning towards video games. They do crowdfunding para maumpisa nila yung paggawa ng video game. And then when it's done, they make sure that the people who back them up financially get to see the finished product. So that's what crowdfunding is. So let's head on to another source or type of startup funding, startup enablers. So we've discussed what startup enablers are during our second session. And under the Innovative Startup Act, also known as RA number 1137, accelerators and incubators are startup enablers. Now, we've already straightened it out before we started this program that City of b.i.t.e.s as an incubator cannot fund you startups. So, kahit anong gawin natin, kahit gustuin namin, hindi kami pwede mag-fund sa inyo, okay? I think mostly because wala talaga kaming budget for that. but instead we help you get funded by introducing you to the TBI network and our cohorts within the startup ecosystem. So that's how we help you get funded. Okay, so you hustle and you meet investors. We've actually conducted several venues of networking dati. We brought, last batch, we brought them to Manila, ang mga startups namin, and then they met with different kinds of enablers actually. Kasi most of them were accelerators. And yung iba, I think you can call them they're a huge company now. Okay, so they usually invest on startups. So they could be venture capital or probably an angel investor. So that's what we do. We give you opportunities. We don't just fly you there. We also, ngayon, since pandemic, we can help you meet them virtually. Okay, so you can pitch to them for startup funding. Now that I've settled the score on why incubators can fund startups, accelerators, on the other hand, are a different story. An accelerator is a program that helps startups, typically those that are a stage away from being established, usually by providing a small amount of seed capital among other services. So some accelerators, to name a few, that are in the that are well known, are b.i.t.e.s Foundation or Philippines, and then, oh my god, okay, nag-brown out na naman guys. Okay, sorry. And then, can you still hear me? Okay, so my mic is still working. So there's Ideaspace, Techstar, Startups, Launch Garage, Plug and Play, and Startup Village. That's just a few of the many, many accelerators all over the Philippines and actually all over the world. So take note that each accelerator is different, but they usually offer a combination of funding and mentorship to startups. So meron talaga silang funding since they're an accelerator. Okay. So one example of that is Brookie. I think you've met them before sa Bites and Brew session natin earlier this month. Okay. So Brookie, a Cagayan de Oro-based startup. Okay. I'm gonna fix this muna. Sorry. Okay, so wait lang guys, because I was actually using two screens earlier, and as I said, nag-brown out ulit. I have no idea what's going on. Thank goodness there's still internet because apparently it's working on generator. So how do I do this? I'll open my my PowerPoint presentation on my phone as well, so I can read the notes I prepared for you. Terribly sorry for the inconvenience. So we weren't expecting this. Okay. So I'll probably have to transfer to a coffee shop later on. Okay. Share screen. Zoom. So, sorry. Okay, so can you see it now properly? Download ko muna. Okay, so yung sinasabi ko kanina regarding kay Brookie, yun, they joined Idea Space. And then yung program ng Idea Space on is, it's para siyang Hunger Games, okay? So it's not exactly a competition, but they have milestones. And may natatanggal ata sa kanila as far as I can remember. That was last year pa kasi. So those who moves forward to the next stage, lumalaki or nadadagdagan yung seed funding nila. So if hindi nila nakamit yung milestone for the next checkpoint ng idea space dun sa program nila, they don't get the seed funding. Okay. So let's head on to the next one. I'm opening my PowerPoint presentation on my phone. Okay. Okay. Sandali lang guys. So let's take a break and pause muna because I have to resettle things muna dito, okay? Sorry. Can you please tell me if nakikita niyo na maayos yung screen ngayon? Okay. 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 So, alright, thank you guys. So, sobrang nagtitweak ako ngayon kasi nawala yung second screen ko. Okay. So, okay, let's head on to the next one. So, we've discussed what startup enablers are. So, let's head on to government grants. So, government grants, as you know, or I know you're already acquainted with this type of startup funding because we discussed this okay. Medyo maarte kasi yung Chrome. So thank you for the suggestion. I'm actually trying to make sure that I'm saving my battery. So we'll try to do this as fast, as quick as possible and through Zoom lang. Sige, kaya to guys, no problem. Ganito ang life ng TBI, flexibility. So let's go back to what I was saying earlier, government grants. I know you're already well acquainted with this type of startup funding because we discussed this during the introduction to the Innovative Startup Act, otherwise known as Republic Act number 11337. So we discussed how startups, provided that they meet the requirements laid by the host agencies, can avail of grants as part of the benefits and incentives of a Philippine startup under the law. So again, emphasize ko, dapat registered kayo, okay? You're not a startup if you're not registered here in the Philippines. So you can look it up again under Rule 5 of RA 11337. which states that a startup grant or SGF shall be provided by the host agencies, namely DOST, the ICD, and DTI for initial and supplemental grants in aid or GIA. Okay, for startups that have, of course, passed the selection and application processes that the host agencies are requiring you to submit. You may also get grants, by the way, by joining and winning pitching competitions hosted by the government. So if you remember this week's Bites and Brew session with Be Free with Tech Innovations and Yes Tech, Be Free, uh, one of our incubatees, they're from the second batch, they were able to secure a 200,000 peso grant, okay, for their startup when they became one of the winners of the Philippine Startup Challenge. So that there you have it. Aside from relying on applying for grants, okay, look out for pitching competitions that are either hosted by the government or by a private entity, because more often than not, the prize is a grant or seed funding. So if you're wondering why there are pitching competitions, especially here in the Philippines, well, it's to promote innovation and entrepreneurship. So, and of course, to encourage existing startups to keep going until they make it. Okay. Uh, Screen is not working. Okay. My goodness. Okay, so okay, I'm once again troubleshooting. Very sorry about this. Okay. Saan na ba to? I'm getting frustrated. Okay, so medyo napipikon na ako sa situation natin because we were not supposed to do this. This was not supposed to happen. Okay, I got it. Okay. Mali. Slide view. Okay. So, eto na. I figured things out na. Okay. So, again, terribly sorry for the technical difficulties. This was not how we practiced it. Okay. So, now that we have covered government grants, eto guys, this is gonna be very, very wordy. Um, um, we'll be tackling venture capital next. Okay. So, alam ko na you've heard this term many times. So, as I said earlier, on to the big words, venture capital. So, you've heard me mentioning it several times today, and now we're finally defining it. Venture capital or VC is money, technical or managerial expertise provided by investors to startup firms with long-term growth potential. I also mentioned earlier that venture capitalists usually take high risks for potential big rewards, which actually translates to them financing a startup company that they think has the potential to grow substantially in the long run, despite the big risks that they're willing to take. VCs typically also only invest in startup companies up to a certain stage. So Yun nga, when before we started with this session, there are stages of startup funding. So meron point na dun nag-fund ang venture capital. The goal of a venture capital investment is very high return for the VC firm. And it is usually in the form of acquisition uh, of the startup or an initial public offering, which is IPO. Now, here's where it gets technical, and I'll have to use a lot of jargon. So, to give you a picture of how venture capital startup funding works, I'll show you a video instead. So again, the objective of this session is to help you understand how various types of startup funding work. So we're trying to deliver it to you in the most effective manner, especially since we're doing this virtually. So this one is, kasi di ba kanina sabi ko, it's very, very maraming words, maraming processes. Now, if we talk about the entirety of venture capital, it might take us hours because you'll have to understand different roles and different, kasi yung roles na yon between roles uh, have different relationships. So, in a guest, I'm going to show you a 2-minute video, I think, of how the picture, how even venture capital is illustrated. Okay. So please tell me if you can see the video as well. Do you see the video on my screen right now?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So wait lang. I-share ko na lang muna. Okay. You share. Okay. So now can you see it? Do you see a gray screen? I'm not playing it yet.
No, ma'am.
It's actually shared. Can you see it?
Wala, ma'am.
Okay, why is this new share? Alright, yung screen ko na lang mismo. So, can you see the screen? The video player, can you see it?
Wala, ma'am.
Why? Okay. Okay. I'm actually, ayaw pa rin. Hindi pa rin nakikita.
Wala, ma'am.
Wait, check. Okay. Sandali ha. Ay, goodness gracious. I'll show you the YouTube video na lang. Let's see. Enter. Now, can you see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I hope okay, naglo-load na siya, nagbo-buffer siya. So ay my God, guys. Sige. Okay, so here is venture capital in a nutshell.
No audio, ma'am.
Okay. Really.
Phone. That's because every time he
Sorry. Okay. Can you hear it
This
now?
is Jack, recent graduate, professional engineer. Lately, Jack's been thinking about his cell phone. That's because every time he tries to call someone from the cottage, he invariably loses reception. But Jack thinks he might have a solution. He's designed a chip. It's no bigger than a fingernail, but Jack says with this chip, a cell phone could receive signals from twice the distance that a regular cell phone can. But it's just an idea. And if Jack wants to prove his theory, he needs to find some money. Chips like this don't make themselves. So he takes his idea to the bank, but they won't give him anything. Jack doesn't have much of a credit rating, and he's got nothing to put up as collateral. The bank can't be sure they'll get their money back. Dejected, but not deterred, Jack makes his way up to the 4th floor of a downtown office building. There he meets Jeannie, a venture capitalist. Jeannie sees a lot of promise in Jack's super chip, so she agrees to give him $500,000, more than enough to get production started. But Jeannie has some conditions. First, she wants to own 60% of the company, and second, she wants to have the final say on all important company decisions. That's fine with Jack. He accepts the conditions, Jeannie gives him the money, and they're off to the races. Jack builds his first chip, and it's a huge success. In less than a year, he's providing chips to every major cell phone company in the country. But Jeannie thinks the chip has gone as far as it can go, so she tells Jack it's time to sell the company. She finds a buyer, and the company sells for $15 million. Since Jack owns 40% of the company, he gets 40% of the profits, or $6 million. The remaining $9 million goes to Jeannie.
All right. So that's what venture capital. So now that you've got the gist of what a venture capital is, let's head on to the next type of startup funding. Before that, if you want to go deep into venture capital and think this is the startup funding scheme you want for your startup, we'll be providing mentoring sessions for you during the Firestarter incubation program. So please don't worry about that. Okay. Ang importante is intindihan nyo what venture capital is. Kasi you'll be hearing this a lot, especially during your pitching and everything. So at least kapag narinig nyo na yung venture capital, hindi na kayo malilito na ano kaya yung meron sa kanila. Okay? So they're probably offering you a venture capital, and the thing is, at least now you understand what it is. So the next one is angel investor. Angel investors, I know you've heard this term before, are usually high net worth individuals who look into putting small amount of financial investments into startup, which can range from a few thousand to millions of pesos. So fondly called as simply angels, angel investors are typically the more accessible form of early stage funding for a startup. An angel investor, because he or she is an individual, can usually make an investment decision on their own. And this is one of the benefits of leaning towards an angel investor for funding. Angel investors are also not burdened by the corporate hierarchy or partnership of decision making. So it allows them to put in money and take risks that they personally feel comfortable with. Now, hindi ko alam kung meron ba tayong specific requirements dito sa Pilipinas of who can be an angel investor, because in the US, not anyone can just be an angel investor, okay? So hindi pwedeng sabihin, may lalapit na lang sa'yo na mag-invest sa'yo na sabihin nila angel investor sila. No. Like I said earlier, angel investors are individuals with high net worth. So, yun nga, yung sa US, yung requirements nila, I think dapat meron silang net worth ng 1 million. Tao lang yun individual, because an angel investor is an individual. Tao lang yun. So, if they have that much net worth, they can be an angel investor. Dito sa Pilipinas, I'm not sure if we've drawn the line already or have requirements for that. But as far as I know, there are a lot of angel investors here in the country as well. So do not be discouraged. Marami kayong makikilala. Okay. So that's the angel investor. So let's head on to last type of startup funding. So it kind of gets tricky here because I'm going to consolidate two topics here, okay? So last but not the least, series funding. So mind you, this is another set of jargon. So series funding is actually a part of the stages of startup funding. So that's what I said when I have to consolidate two topics. So I'm talking about types of startup funding right now, but we're going to delve into the stages of startup funding as well. So when a startup is still in its early or ideation stage, angel investors may become interested and put in money, convinced that the startup has high potential for sustainability despite the higher risks. So that's the stage before series funding. So after this stage, series funding comes in, okay? There are actually 3 stages of series funding. So in order for you to understand this, here's a graph of the stages of startup funding or startup investment. So makikita niyo sa screen na indicated that the higher the amount, the money for investment, the stage of the investment progresses, okay? And then you can see here where, which stage, there's the concept research, business planning, product development, first commercial, fully commercial, expansion, and ready for IPO. So now that we're still defining series funding, which is one of the types of startup funding, we'll have to tackle this, okay? So as I said earlier, there are 3 series fundings, which you can identify in the graph as the green, violet, and orange circles. Okay. So the Series A fund, a round of funding, the one with the blue arrow, begins when a startup builds some form of momentum following on from the seed stage of their business. Series A funding is focused almost entirely on revenue growth. So it looks into the development, operations, branding, and marketing of the startup as common elements of the startup's growth. So the valuation of the startup in this particular funding round is done on the basis of proof of concept, progress made with seed capital or with the angel investor, quality of executive team, market size, and the risk involved. Ultimately, the goals of Series A funding are to cover the salaries of the people involved, additional market research, and the finalization of the product service to be introduced into the market. So that's Series A. Now, heading on to Series B, Series B funding is sought when a company has already proven market viability and now needs to expand. Since the stage focus is growth, the common elements of this series funding are hiring, market expansion, and buying businesses. All right. So since this round of funding is required by the company to scale up, at this stage, the goal of this round of funding is not only to break even, but also to have the net profit. So there you have it. Ang difference niya with Series A is Series A nagbi-build pa ng momentum. Okay. When sa Series B, expansion na yan. So, okay, there's na-proven na yung sustainability niya. So, the investors are looking into expanding. Okay. So, next one, Series C. We're still defining series funding, of course, which is one of the types of startup funding. Okay. So, last but not the least, Series C funding. The often final stage of funding is referred to as Series C funding, and it is primarily sought when a startup wants to take part in large-scale expansions. These expansions typically involve moving into a new market or acquiring other businesses that are invaluable towards the future success of the company. Startups that want to expand into a new market at this stage are usually looking to expand into international markets, which is why such an extensive amount of funding may be necessary. This round of funding is actually more of an exit strategy of the venture capital firm as well. So if you remember the video which we watched earlier, at a point in venture capital, my exit strategy. So this is where it usually comes in during Series C. So here's another thing. Series C is actually not the last one, but like I mentioned earlier, it is often the final stage. There's actually a Series D and Series E as well, but it's rare for companies to choose to move on to these stages, so we don't need to delve into that. So mezzanine is, as you can see, is the highest stage. It's technically ready for IPO, meaning exit stage din yan, and with a huge amount of money. So again, if you want to, we will provide mentorship sessions under the Fire Startup Incubation Program for the specific parts of startup funding, so that you are trying to lean towards too. Okay, so that's it. That's the stages and the types of startup funding. Ganun kasimple. Okay, in a nutshell. So let's head on to the last part of my talk. You're wondering bakit pinupush namin ang startup funding? Why? Why startup funding? Why not just bootstrap, di ba? I mean, siguro ako, kung malaki yung pera nyo, sige. Or kaya nyo mag-bootstrap on your own. Use your own savings, use your own money. You can do that. But there are pros to startup funding. First of all, you grow your startup idea on a solid base, okay? Developing the initial idea into the solid product often requires more money and a bigger team. So it means that if you make your idea alive, you'll need to hire more employees, attract specialists in the field, invest into production costs, and keep the operations running steadily in the development phase. So if your goal is to have your company last for a long, long time, startup funding is the feasible way. So another thing, good thing about startup funding is that it saves time. Okay? It captures as much of the market in as little time as possible. Okay? To compete on the market with other dominant players, you'll need to increase your marketing and sales effort. This again can only be done when you have enough money, okay, or a proper startup funding. Imagine if nag-bootstrap ka and then nag-aano ka na you're operating na, and then hindi naman naghihingal yung startup mo. It's okay, but it takes longer for you to get to your goal. Well, meanwhile, yung mga competition nyo, they have funding, backers, financial backers. They're getting there already. So that's why one of the reason why we wanted to lead towards startup funding is because so you can get ahead the competition and also save time. Okay. So you also get additional value from your investors. Okay. The first reason to contact investors is, of course, to get funding. But investors can offer more than just money. They can help you get deals with other companies with which they have connections. After all, your success in the market is in their interest as well. So yung value from the investors, hindi talaga mapapalitan yan, guys. When you get an investor, they form part of your network. Okay, you are connected with them, and because they have a vested interest on making sure that your startup makes it, they will help you. Okay, they will help you, and they will help you connect to the connections they have, to the network they have. So that's one of the things you have to consider. Okay, when you do that with bootstrapping, it's very hard. Okay, if as much as possible, kaya nyo mag-networking ng marami, gawin nyo. That's very crucial then when you're in your startup journey. Okay, you have to make the most out of the startup ecosystem. So lastly, of course, trends for startup fundings. Positive trends in funding for Philippine startups. With startups making it out there, you're also helping the country by drawing in investment. So, yun na yun. You're helping the economy, you're making more jobs, you're getting in investors into the country because syempre, registered startup kayo, company within the Philippines. So, the trends for startup fundings increases. Okay. So, that's about it. About understanding for the terms under startup funding. So, I hope you are able to understand everything despite the technical difficulties. Okay, so let's open the floor for question and answer. By the way, our next speaker will be available by 11:30. So we'll take a short break before her talk, okay? So, para din po na effective po yung Q&A na to, hindi lang po ako yung sasagot. So, I'd like the rest of my b.i.t.e.s team to help out with any questions the incubatees have. Okay, Rhea and Kai especially have backgrounds in business management, so they're very well versed in investments and startup funding. So do you have any questions? You may raise I don't need to raise your hand, just unmute yourself and ask away so we can answer your question. Guys, walang tanong? Walang tanong? Okay na? Naiintindihan nyo? Feeling ko hindi kayo nakinig na maayos dahil ang pangit ng presentation. Okay, so nag-aano kami ngayon dito. I have no idea what's wrong with electricity right now. Okay. So no questions. Are you positive that you actually understood lahat ng sasabi ko dito? If an investor suddenly comes up to you and then say, I'll be your venture capitalist, would you understand it? or ano tawag dito, if an angel investor comes up to you, I hope na maintindihan nyo kung ano yung role nila as an angel investor. Okay? So don't worry, kasi I know you're still hindi naman confused, siguro overwhelmed with the information kasi it's mabigat, no? It's a lot of words, it's a lot of terms to understand. There's stages, there's types, okay? Iniisip nyo, investment lang, but no, there's the different kinds of startup fundings. Now, how to get valuation? Okay. Susie, hello Rhea and Kai. How do you get valuation now? Can you please answer on my behalf? Okay. Mamaya, yung speaker natin, she's actually from the investor investment field. So she'll be talking about ito. It's like what I did is like an orientation of startup funding because she'll be talking about the startup how startup funding works in the Philippines. So, yung situation, yung schemes, especially ngayon na pandemic. So, in order to understand that, you have to get a grasp of what the different types of startup fundings are and its stages. Okay. So, you may ask her questions later on, okay, after her talk. So, okay. Unfortunately, Rhea is naging offline din siya kasi ayun ako guys, they're testing, the universe is probably playing with us because may nasunog banda sa tabi ng bahay ni na Rhea and then nasira yung natamaan yung internet line nila. So, I'm sorry. I have an idea of what valuation is, but I really don't think I can answer it effectively. So later on with our speaker, please raise this question again, okay? Because siya mismo, she can answer that, especially now that the pandemic has become a game changer for innovation and for investment entirely. So that may have changed, okay? So to give you a tease of who you'll be expecting later on, our next speaker will be Miss Goldy Yancha, okay? So I'll introduce her later on. She'll be on at 11:30 a.m. because she has a meeting right now. So mga 11:30 pa siya pwede. So wala na po kayong ibang top question. I mean, naiintindihan ko. Kasi kahit ako mismo, if I'm listening to this right now, yun nga, like I said, it's heavy. Okay? Maraming kailangan intindihin. Maraming information. It's an information overload. Okay. So I guess if wala na kayong questions, wala daw fun. Wala daw fun sa funding. Yes, actually, it's actually the hard part. Okay, one of the difficult parts of a startup journey, ang funding. Kasi imposibleng gumalaw yung startup nyo nang walang pera. Okay? Especially You have to bear in mind, guys, that startup has to make profit. Yun yung sinabi ko dati na even though wala siya sa requisites ng startups under the law, ang startup has to have profit, okay? If you're an advocacy or probably siguro yung binibigay niyo for charity, you're not a startup, okay? Kahit sabihin kong startup kayo, the government or the law will not recognize you as a startup because you're not earning money, you're not getting money out there as well. So walang flow of cash, walang investment. So profit and funding is really needed sa startup. So what about the business chamber groups, ma'am? Na-reach out na ba sila already? Okay, so ang scenario here, as of last year, since hindi pa kami nakikita ulit ng business chamber groups due to the pandemic, the hope here is referring to the local chamber group. Okay, so kasi sila yung nakakalubilo namin dito. They've actually ventured into non-traditional ideas, concepts. In fact, just last year, they've already launched b.i.t.e.s, where they showcase various startups, various businesses all over. I'm not sure if Cagayan de Oro lang ata kasi local business chamber siya. So very open sila. They also initiated industry academe, ano ko yung term dyan eh. Basta yung pinipair up yung isang business with a partner from an academe and then industry so they can help that business na lumago. Okay? Para lalo na, like last time, CDO b.i.t.e.s was partnered up with a paper crafting company. Okay? So they were engaged into creating paper crafts. Then here's the thing, local sila. Dito sila mismo sa Cagayan de Oro, but nobody buys their products here. Ang lahat ng client nila nasa labas. Sobrang laki. Ang laki ng demand nila sa labas. Ang laki ng kita nila, but nobody's buying it locally. So, in order for them to meet the demands of their international clients, they were paired up with us as well with other offices here in the university to check her business model, the business model of their company, because kailangan siyang i-update to adhere to the innovation. Okay, especially since innovation, changes a lot, and then one of the aspects of innovation na kailangan is is she had to secure heavy equipment that can kayang gampanan yung demands ng international market na. Business to industry pairing. It was our chamber who organized it, and then they facilitated it along with USAID. Not USAID, pero various enablers, government agencies like b.i.t.e.s, d.i.t.e.s. Kasi host agencies sila. So, ngayon, hindi na po traditional talaga yung business chamber groups. They're leaning towards the concept of startups na, okay? So, you don't have to worry about that. The thing is, you just have to make them understand why startups need their help. Okay, so any more questions? Thank you for that. I hope I was able to answer your question. You're welcome. Okay. So if you don't have any more questions, I can conclude my part of the talk. Pero kung may mga questions pa kayo, feel free again to post it on Lark, email us, and or post it, ano tawag dito? Punta, ilagay niyo sa comment section nung Facebook group. So yung PDF nito at saka yung recording will be made available immediately within the day, okay? After the session. So don't worry if merong parts na hindi niyo na naiintindihan masyado dahil sa technical difficulties earlier, you can look into it, okay? Later on. So I guess that's it for my part. We'll take a break and we'll resume at 11:30. So please be online by 11:20 so we can start on time. All right? Thank you very much, everyone. Okay. So kung hindi pa to pandemic, hindi pa to virtual, snack time muna tayo. Okay? So let's take a break and let's meet up again. Same link, okay? So we'll still be online. So pwedeng hindi na kayo mag-log out of leave the meeting. Okay, we'll just leave it on until Goldy, our next speaker, comes out. All right, thank you. See you later.